Hi, I'm John DeArmond with Coquille Valley Sword Group, and today we're talking about Article 3 of the Heiau Sanjugo Kasho. So, let's begin. Article 3. How the sword is held. To hold the sword correctly, the forefinger and thumb should hold lightly, the middle finger with medium strength, the ring finger and little finger firmly. As with the sword, there is life and death with the hand. The hand is dead, which, when holding, parrying, or stopping, forgets the actual aim of cutting the opponent and becomes rigid. The living hand is always relaxed and calm, in harmonious balance with the sword, in preparedness to cut. When holding the sword, the wrists should not be twisted, the elbow not stretched too much, but also not bent too much. The upper muscles of the arms should be relaxed, and the lower muscles tensed. This should be carefully observed. So, with Article 1 and 2, we set kind of the two cardinal points of Hyoho, right? That using a sword one-handed is good, and using a sword in both hands is a great way to train that. 2, that the microcosm mimics the macrocosm in terms of strategy. If you understand large scale, you understand small scale, you understand everything, right? Now we're getting into more technical work. Article 3 is all Teinouchi, obviously. So it starts off by talking about the sort of basic composure of the hand, right? Which is to say, lightly, medium, firm. Now, he talks about, in this next section, this life and death in the hand. Well, what does that mean, right? Well, luckily, he lays it out for us. He says, hey, the hand is dead when it's rigid. Basically, if you're doing stuff with the sword and your hand is rigid, which is to say its form is stationary and tense, you're doing it wrong, right? Well, why is that? What does it mean? Like, we can understand the analogy, like a living hand has movement and adaptation to it, while the dead hand, is like a lock, it doesn't grow. But what does that mean for our work, right? And it's simple, right? Or at least it's simple once you start doing tameshigiri, right? You start doing some cutting work. When you cut, if your hand is tense, your wrist tends to be tense, and the cut, it tends to drag your form, drag your body, and so you'll see people who will cut and their head will be jerked down with it, right? Now, in the Gorin no Sho, he talks about this a little bit more when he speaks on people that cut with strength and as a result cut too coarsely. It's not to say that you can't lock your body with full tension and just swing with all of your physical strength through a target and not cut it. Of course you can, right? But it's not about just cutting it, right? These swords, when they're well made, are unreasonably sharp, right? And because of their mass, they cut very well. I mean, there's 1,000 years of technological innovation in these weapons, and they're designed to do one thing: cut flesh targets, and they do it real good. So if you can accidentally cut something grievously by dropping it on it, why do you really need to put a lot more effort into it? I mean, obviously, if you have a strategic goal in mind, putting effort might be a part of that to accomplish a goal beyond just cutting. In the same way that we cut opponents down and we use our cutting to direct and drive people. But other schools may have their own method, of course. But in Hyoho, the sword's going to cut. We know it's going to cut. What we need to do is to wield the sword dexterously. to wield the sword in such a way that it's wielded in a free and lively manner. Now this doesn't mean we're moving just for the sake of moving, but rather that to our strategy, the ability to move is what is fundamentally the way we protect ourselves and the way we strike out at the enemy. It is kind of like it's the gas for our vehicle, right? So anything that sort of corrupts a good quality of motion, i.e. tension, right? We tend to try and be really mindful, right? Because obviously tension is necessary. Muscular tension is required. Otherwise you're just a puddle on the ground, right? But both because people are doing a motion that is awkward by comparison of the motions that they practice every day in their life, right? You have very few repetitions swinging a sword compared to opening the fridge or flushing the toilet, right? So it's going to be more awkward than those basic motions. I forget where I was going. I guess the point is, your work is already going to be rough and hard as you try and build up to being able to move easily. Adding extra tension into it, it just kind of exacerbates it. So, but again, even in this section, Musashi says, hey, what is your arm to be like, right? We know that the hand is to be alive, supple. Well, forearm is going to be tight. It's going to have tension in the forearm because the forearm supports the wrist, supports the transmission of force, and supports the force itself. So not just the ability to get that almost whip-like power drive through it, but that when we strike a person, it's supported behind, right? We can strike and drive through a target. It's not as though we strike and everything collapses. But doesn't mean the whole arm needs to be tense. Obviously, we need this articulation, right? We need that suppleness in the wrist and hand, in the elbow, and that means relaxing that upper arm, right? Shoulder, bicep, tricep, the whole kit and caboodle has to be soft and lively. So you get this real easy mechanical motion. This kind of arm position and learning to really study the effects of tension in your form as you're working, and not necessarily its effect on target, but kind of in a roundabout way. Tsuburi, rhythmic swinging practice, is a really good training tool that when I started, I had a very limited view on. I thought that, okay, well, if we're going to do 50 swings in a morning, or 100 swings in a morning, or whatever, well, why would they tell a student this? In my juvenile mind, I figured that it was just a matter of giving people an opportunity to practice the basics of the motion itself. In other words, how is my posture? How is my tight tsubaki? How is my footwork? How am I executing the cut itself? Where is my mind while I execute the cut, right? And just practicing all those sort of nuanced things. And that after a person basically became proficient with it, that there was no need. My feelings have really come around to this idea, however, because though there are a lot of things, a lot of elements of traditional training that I either advocate kind of, not against, but I try and point out the limitations to, or that I just don't use in my own training work that I teach, I still tend to train that way in my personal training out of habit. And so, because to me, yeah, of course there are going to be things that come up that need to change or need to grow. Like if, for example, if we had a strong unarmed element in Hyoho. And all of its positions were based around Seiza, right? Being a person in America where most people are just not on the floor very often, it would not... I would be inclined to change the kata to standing kata, so that people could more readily see the application. Anyway, I don't know, a big sidetrack there. With Subari, right? If you practice a basic motion again and again and again, even long after you understand the motion, long after you're proficient with it, an interesting thing starts to happen, which is that your conscious mind, your thinking mind, is freed from having to micromanage every aspect of the physical body motion. And it gets kind of bored then. It goes, hey, well, we're doing this thing and I don't really have a lot to think about. What could I think about? And you start noticing things in your body. Very subtle things. How force is generated, how force is transferred, how force is supported. You begin to notice subtle differences in your body's orientation, in the order of operation that you go through when you go to move. There's really a lot to be learned, and so if you're having trouble with this whole gripping the sword, swinging it, and not just... You don't have someone there that can correct you. You don't feel like making a video and sending it to me, or better yet, send it to Hombu, right? Send it to the main dojo and see if you can get information from them. Just do Subari, right? And cut, and cut, and cut. And, 100 swings is a pretty good number, I think. Right now, because I'm doing kind of an extra set of training, I'm doing about 400 technique, Waza Subari style, every couple of days. And I'm finding that 100 is real good, because for the first 25, 35, your mind is really sharply engaged in what you're doing. And then it kind of like, it meanders a little bit. It comes off the subject, and this is, it can be good and bad depending on how you harness it. But for me, I'm okay with letting it go. I don't have to micromanage it, right? Because I'm personally hunting that Mushin Muken, right? That no mind, no sword that Musashi talks about in Book of the Void, right? Yeah. And so not trying to worry about when to swing or how to swing, and just kind of giving over the wheel is what I'm going for. And that's, after that, repetitions 60 through the rest of them is when I'm really getting a lot of insight into my own sort of inner body work and support with the thrusts and cuts. So I would definitely suggest 100 as a nice even number. Don't do it every day, right? A lot of Kendoka will do it every day, and that's great and wonderful. It's a good way to end up with pretty severe repetitive movement injuries in your elbows and wrists, especially if you don't know how to rehabilitate yourself. You don't know any physical therapy or practice good stretching. So give it a go. The practice is self-instructive, right? That's why Musashi, ends most of his segments on, hey, you'll understand if you practice. So that's the truth, right? It's not so obscured that you can't get a sense of it if you continually practice diligently while you're focused on the way, right? It's easy to get off on tangents, right? You're like, oh yeah, Musashi said this thing, and I'm going to do this thing, and then all of a sudden you go back and someone says, hey, well, where did he say that? You go, oh, right here, you reread it, it's like, oh, well, what he was saying was not exactly that, right? You have to come back to it. But, figure it out. So, moving forward, we talked about how tension was bad for cutting. We talked about this idea, the living hand is always relaxed and calm, right? What does that mean? I mean, when we're cutting something, people tend to really think that cutting is hard. And because they think of cutting in the same way that a person might think of picking up a heavy box, they tend to engage the same body processes, those same large muscle groups to support and sustain the weight. And that's just not the case, right? Cutting should be soft, right? Supported, immovable, body of the rock, but soft, right? It seems like very opposing concepts, but they're not really, right? Play with it. See if you can get it. He mentions the wrist not being twisted. What's that about? In some styles, there are methods of cutting that involve twisting the wrists at sort of an awkward angle. Or not, it doesn't feel awkward necessarily when you do it, but Musashi basically says, don't do that, right? He doesn't say why, but based on the other things that he's written, I think it's because that in the same way, if you bend with just your shoulders and not your hips, you segment your upper body's support and strength from your lower body's. The same thing can happen on smaller joints, right? And I think that, since the wrist-hand articulation is already at weak point, that sort of isolating all the strength and support just to that one little part of your body is what he's trying to advocate against. But it's just an opinion, right? I could be wrong. He mentions elbow extension versus under extension. In the Go Red No Show, he goes into this a little bit better to admonish people not to make these chopping cuts. Well, what's a chopping cut? A chopping cut is basically this. Your elbow is it's the main articulation point, right? It does all the work. My wrist isn't really moving much. My shoulder and body aren't moving much. It's not this sort of flow, this full-bodied cut, right? Bam! Now, just as this underextension of the arm is bad for a lot of reasons, overextending the arm is bad. You'll see some styles that really, not really many, a lot of modern styles or modern variants like Iaido that really say just push that arm far, get that nice big long arc, really get that tip accelerating. You hear that big, tachikaze, that big sword swoosh through the air, right? Let you know you're powerful, doing it right? And in non-combative arts like Iaido, that's fine, right? They're not fighting people. They're looking, is my technique good, right? Objectively good. And listening to that tachikaze tells you if your Hasuji's on or not, right? So it's good for their application, but for us in Yoho, that's, we would no sooner expose that brachial artery than just go here, right? It's just not combatively sound. Yeah, so he ends the sort of first section on technical work by saying that this should be carefully observed, right? Well, why is that? Because we use the sword one-handed a lot. Now, When you use a sword with two hands, you can have a lot more variation in your teinouchi, how you hold your sword, and have it be safe for you. Be able to effectively fence in whatever the method is that you're learning. But when you start to use the sword in one hand, because you have one sort of part of your body as the contact and control point, it has to do a lot more things, right? And because it has to do more jobs, right? There's not as much room for error, right? So, for instance, some styles advocate holding the sword sort of like so. The index knuckle over the mune, and the sword sort of resting in between the heel of the thumb and the heel of the hand, right? It's a convenient way to hold the sword in that it naturally puts the sword in line with your bones. It gives people a much easier time sort of developing a sense intuitively where that good edge alignment is. But if we were to do this one-handed and someone were to strike our sword, we'd lose it, right? It's just working against other people who intend to screw up your work. You really have to start really stabilizing that connection point without over tensing it, right? Because again, if we just grip maw this first, typically what you'll find is the more tension a person has on an item that you're trying to make them drop, the easier it is for them to drop it by striking it. Of course, if they're holding it like nothing, you can do it that way too. But this sort of balanced, lively grip, it absorbs impact, it deflects impact, but you still maintain control of the tool. So it's more better, right? So that is the third article. Again, we talked about a lot of this in the teinouchi video. So if you're looking for more content on how to hold the sword, why we hold the sword, or how do you hold a sword in specific situations, you can check that one out. And that's about it. So, as always, if you want to understand this, you got to pick up a sword and go train.